Hello, good afternoon, everybody. Welcome to this Daily Maverick webinar. I am Ray Mahlaka and I am with the Daily Maverick. First of all, thanks to ENSafrica for supporting this webinar. And this afternoon, we'll be talking about the potential grey listing of South Africa. We are hearing a lot about South Africa being potentially grey listed early next year. So essentially, South Africa has to demonstrate to the world that it is serious about stopping the flows of dirty money. The country has to show that it has robust measures in place to also stop acts of terrorist financing and other financial crimes. By early next year, an organization called the Financial Action Task Force, or FATF, will make a determination about whether South Africa should be grey listed or not. Experts tell us that the grey listing will be devastating for South Africa's economy and reputation. Well, we have two excellent experts this afternoon who will help us with the topic of grey listing. We have Dr. Stuart Theobald. He is the chairman of a research-led consulting firm called Intellidex. Hey, Stuart, thanks for joining us.
Pleasure, good to be with you.
Lovely. And we have the National Treasury's acting Director General, Ishmael Momoniat. Ishmael, hi there.
Hi there, and to your listeners.
Absolutely.
And to Stuart as well.
Absolutely. So please, everyone, participate in the webinar. As always, we love to hear your questions and your comments. Hello, Alan. Derek is joining us. Gloria, Maurice, Charles, hello there, Andrew, and so many others. You know, Stuart, perhaps we need to start with you. Let's start with the basics. A lot of things have been said about, you know, the Financial Action Task Force, or the FATF. Can you help us understand what is the FATF? And can you help us understand its role, responsibility, and mandate as well? Let's start from there.
Sure. The FATF has been around for quite a long time, going back into the 1980s. And it's really been set up as a global monitor for anti-money laundering, given that money laundering is a global activity, that crime is committed in one place and money can flow to other jurisdictions and return and move. It has to be something that's dealt with worldwide. And since the September 11th terrorist attacks in 2001, it has also come to focus on terrorist financing as well. So you now have these two areas of focus in money laundering and terrorist financing. And the way FATF works is through a system of peer reviews. So it assesses countries on how compliant they are with a set of recommendations. And FATF has drawn up a set of 40 key recommendations that it says that countries that comply with those 40 recommendations are deemed to be worthy counterparts for members of FATF. So that's the core mechanism. Now, the peer reviews are done periodically. South Africa went through a peer review that started in 2019. COVID kind of led to some delays, but there was a report eventually published in 2021. And that report made several negative findings on South Africa. So it found overall that South Africa only complied with half of the 40 recommendations. And moreover, it found that South Africa wasn't effectively enforcing many of its regulations as well. So it found South Africa fell short on all 11 of FATF's measures of effective outcomes, that it's not good enough to just have laws in your books. You have to be actively enforcing and undertaking them. So that on those grounds, FATF then began a period of enhanced monitoring and effectively gave South Africa a year's notice to say, we want to see substantial progress of you coming into alignment with the core FATF recommendations and effectiveness. And the assessment is going to culminate in a plenary in February next year, at which a decision must be made about grey listing.
Yeah. And I guess that's where the concern comes in, about whether we'll be grey listed or not. But Ishmael, let me bring you in here. I wanted to go back to about 2003. I think that's when South Africa became a member of FATF. But please correct me if I'm wrong. You've been a public servant for many, many years, and you've seen, so many administrations, come in and go. Can you please take us back then in 2003? What was the thinking behind South Africa being a member of FATF?
Yeah, no, thanks, Ray. Look, I wasn't personally involved, even though I was at the Treasury at the time. But, it was an initiative that I think the late Dalla Umar and Trevor Manuel seem to have championed. That in the first administration under President Mandela, that the work had been done. South Africa began to join various anti-corruption agreements. In particular, I think, I'm just trying to remember the dates, but Kofi Annan was championing the UN Declaration Against Corruption, UNODC, something like that. And South Africa, I think, had a process where I think the Law Commission went into this matter, made some recommendations, but between Trevor Manuel and Dalla Umar, they had started the process of getting the Financial Intelligence Center Act. I think that process would have been around 2001, and the law got passed, and then we had set into motion the process to join FATF. And by 2003, we were accepted as members of FATF. There's a process. You can't just go and sign up. And even today, FATF only has 39 members.
So that's the context. And Stuart, a lot of people are asking us, what is the likelihood of us not being grey listed? But first, let's understand what a grey listing is. Can you help us with that, Stuart?
So grey listing basically says to members of FATF, those 39 that Momo mentioned, that a particular country requires enhanced due diligence in order to do business with it. Now, because the members of FATF are all the biggest economies in the world, to be classified on the grey list means that most of our trading counterparts will then have to apply this enhanced due diligence to doing business with South Africans. Now, that can mean many things. It can mean that foreign institutions could just refuse to do business with South African institutions. It can mean that it will apply a more invasive due diligence process. So usually we're used to the kind of know your client work that happens in South Africa. Well, that happens on an international scale as well. And foreign counterparts are going to be much more demanding and intrusive about South African counterparts. Now, that just kind of adds transaction costs. I think it's kind of unprecedented for a country like South Africa to experience this. It's not the biggest economy. The Philippines, Pakistan has been grey listed, recently ungrey listed. Turkey are bigger. But South Africa, in many ways, the most sophisticated financially economy to face this in terms of the extent of our capital markets, our integration with the global economy. So it's kind of unprecedented as how the world will react if we were to be grey listed. There will be this enhanced due diligence that banks and other counterparts will do in the rest of the world. There'll also be a negative reputation effect because it basically is a mark that says South Africa is not up to scratch in combating money laundering and terrorist financing. And that can have many intangible effects on appetites to do business with South Africa and so on. But the enhanced due diligence will be felt. So the European Union, the United Kingdom, for instance, have worked into their regulations that all accountable institutions like banks would immediately have to apply enhanced due diligence. And you might find, for example, that banks in those jurisdictions will refuse to accept incoming transfers from South African institutions. There's just one example of the kind of response we've seen. Now, the extent to which counterparts are going to do that in a way that hurts South African business interests, we will see. But I think we can say safely that a lot will depend on how they perceive South Africa's determination to get off the grey list. And that's going to be key, because counterparts will be willing to put up with a bit of pain, a bit of higher risk in doing business with South Africans if it's perceived as a short-lived issue. But if it's something that could be entrenched and long-running, they'll be much less willing, and that's when the costs will start to rack up.
Yeah. And just for context, I think South Africa would join other countries such as Pakistan, Nicaragua, if my memory serves me well, the Cayman Islands and the UAE, countries and regions that are also grey listed as well, right, Stuart?
Yeah, so Pakistan has just come off the grey list, but yeah, Turkey, Philippines, Morocco, and countries like Mali, Albania, Haiti, Jamaica, those are the countries that find themselves on the grey list at the moment.
Ishmael, South Africa's banking and financial system is often praised and celebrated for being sophisticated, but I think state capture has laid bare the deficiencies in the banking sector and how easy it was for dirty money or proceeds of corruption to move through the banking system. Your view about what's your assessment of our financial systems, and where are the deficiencies, you think, Ishmael?
Yeah, look, I think, we still need to get all the facts on who did what and why. I think that the Zondo Commission, and if you saw the affidavits from the various banks, was extremely informative. But I guess the question in my mind is, what took banks so long to act before they closed the accounts of the Guptas? But you see, they could have a different question, that they were complying, they were filing their suspicious transaction records, and what did the authorities do? And I think that's a very legitimate question, because I think that's where the big weakness was, that if banks were acting and did file suspicious transaction records, then the authorities really looked the other way, essentially, and nothing much happened. So it's, and in fact, the Zondo Commission has actually recommended that the FIC review the entire process, because I do think that just generally that our system of fighting crime has been quite naive. And I think, when I look at the FATF recommendations and I take a step back,
sure,
you can quibble about little things they say here and there. But I think the big issue is that our system is so naive that we can't act, that we are suckers almost for dealing with criminal syndicates, which are obviously highly organized. So it's not about your small crimes, but these criminal syndicates. So if you looked at, for example, even in the time of state capture, the Guptas, I think there were many, many red flags. But whether it was banks, whether it was the authorities, they looked the other way. And the bigger issue is that we do need to get our entire ecosystem to begin to open their eyes and realize that more needs to be done. We need to be more vigilant. And importantly, we need to be able to act much quicker than we do. And often you don't have to just resort to taking criminal action. That would be important and good. But administratively, there's much that could be done with the system. So I'll give you an example. One of the initiatives that we engage with the FIC to say, look, if you look at the UK, they have a structure called GMLAT, okay, which is where they work with their banks, so that as you know, there's bank confidentiality, so one bank can't tell another bank what's happening with any of its clients. They won't share client information. But the creation of this SAMLAT, which the FIC runs with banks, I think is a good forum. The challenge is, how do they utilize it so that they don't just look at individual STRs or suspicious transaction records, but they begin to try and discuss trends and try and follow the money in a more coherent way between the banks. Because, so I think there's yeah, to answer your initial question, I mean, I think, yes, I'm sure we can find that we all should have moved faster. Our bank should have moved faster. The authorities should have moved with more determination and quicker. But for me, it's what are the lessons? Because even now, I don't believe that in our system, and I think this is what I'm saying FATF found, that our system is too naive. And the challenge is, how do you get all these authorities to work together to deal with money laundering, to deal with criminal syndicates, to deal with terror financing? And that requires more sharing of information and, an ability to act quickly.
Yeah, and I think in the press sometime last year, Ishmael, you warned that South Africa was in danger of becoming a mafia state if you don't, put in place measures that combat against money laundering. But Stuart, let's bring you in here. In FATF's report last year, it recommended that South Africa should show progress in implementing recommendations or priority actions, about more than 17 priority actions. It gave us about 18 months to do so. FATF recommended that South Africa moves with speed in terms of prosecuting state capture corruption, providing the Hawks with more forensic investigators, and ensuring that attorneys and estate agents are can better monitor money laundering and terrorist financing risk, and also focusing on money laundering itself and not lump it together with general corruption. But from 18 months to now, do you think South Africa has moved fast with a clear plan on implementing the FATF recommendations in order to avoid a grey listing?
Look, I think there was a slow start. It took quite a while for things to galvanize. But I must say in the last 3 to 6 months, things really have accelerated. And we've seen a lot of work under National Treasury's leadership to try and deliver on FATF's asks. And you might have seen that on Friday, the omnibus bill was adopted in Parliament. That's a very important piece of legislation to get the technical compliance right. So the compliance of the 40 recommendations, many of those depended on that legislation. Still has to go through National Council of Provinces and so on, but important step forward last week. The challenge, though, is the effectiveness, right? So you can get all the laws on your books, but what FATF is really looking for is a demonstration on these being effective in practice. And that really means prosecution, successful prosecution, sentencing, people going to jail. And that really is where we have a problem trying to demonstrate that we've achieved things, that we've turned things around. Now, the National Prosecuting Authority, I think, has done a very good job recently in getting the cases onto the books, into the courts. So we now have, I think, 29 at last count of active cases regarding state capture, which is very important. But we would be better off if we were walking into that February plenary with people in jail, convictions, successful prosecutions, and that gap is going to hurt us. On the priority actions that FATF recommended, there are some where we've, I think, made good progress, but some where it's going to be very difficult. So you mentioned the accountable institutions that need to be better supervised, like attorneys and so on. You know, the legislation now allows for the Financial Intelligence Center to be much more active supervisors of AML risk in those. But the center itself hasn't implemented the capacity to be able to do that. It takes budgeting. They've got to basically double their staff. So it's a complex and difficult process for them to do that. The other area that's really important is beneficial ownership. So FATF requires us to capture information about who owns companies, who are beneficiaries of trusts, and so on. And that requires, again, big systems changes in how the CIPC captures that data, and importantly, how the master's offices capture data regarding trusts. And the master's offices are quite significantly far from having the capacity and ability to do that effectively. So those kind of effectiveness measures are where our real challenge lies. And I think that's where it's going to take quite some doing to convince FATF that we've made sufficient progress for them to avoid greylisting us.
Yeah, I mean, when you talk about that, you know, beneficial owners matter, I think Ishmael is pushing ahead with some law amendments because we definitely want a sort of like a registry where we know who owns assets and who stands to benefit from money laundering practices, which is a practice globally. But Ishmael, do you think the proposals you've put in place as a national treasury, will those help us to avoid being greylisted potentially, you think?
Yeah, look, I'm still optimistic that there is a path for us to prevent greylisting. It may not be likely, it's certainly not likely, but I think there is a path. I've not given up. And I think, like Stewart said, there's legislation before Parliament, there's 2 bills, and they are both at an advanced stage in the National Assembly. They should be both passed by the Assembly in a week or 2, and by the end of the year, both should have, by February, will be able to show that largely this, what the FATF language is, technical compliance with 20 of the 40 recommendations. I think the laws themselves deal, we think, with about 16 of the 20, and then they require some regulations and other measures, but we'd get there on technical compliance. Bear in mind, we don't have to, if we weren't put on this greylisting threat, or what's called the observation period, we would actually have about 3 to 5 years to remedy the deficiencies that FATF's identified. And that generally happens with most countries. They then take 3 to 5 years to fix up the system. And in most countries, they find many, many deficiencies. So hopefully on the technical compliance, that will be a big step. But like Stewart says, it's in effectiveness that we are lacking. And look, that is a general South African problem. It's all about implementation, right? And that's where we lack. But even there, I'm quite optimistic. If you look at, there's 3 or 4 of the immediate outcome measures are related to prosecutions, investigations, prosecutions, for features. I think compared to 2019, where I would argue that our entities were at their weakest, it was just, they were coming out of state capture, they just had, say, a new head appointed, they hardly had any cases to show. Whereas now I think, slow it's been as it has been, but there is a consistency and we are seeing the cases tally up. So we would be able to show that we've made fairly significant progress. Sure, we still need to make much, much more progress. But if we can demonstrate that for each of the measures, there's commitment and we've made progress, and even if you don't pass all 11 measures, I'm hoping that FATF will then say, okay, you guys have done enough, and obviously they'll still put us under enhanced supervision, what they call it, the enhanced oversight, but we can avoid it. And I think the second point is what Stewart also, I think, mentioned earlier, that to the extent that if we get grey-listed, but we've demonstrated that we've changed the laws, we've demonstrated that we've made progress on 5 or 6 of the measures, it's a very different message that will come through, that South Africa has made progress, it just needs a bit more time, and the impact, I think, will be less. And certainly, I'm hoping on the financial sector side with correspondent banks and so on, we'll have passed the test. The other areas like, again, Stewart has touched on this. If you look at your legal profession, if you look at car dealers, you look at estate agents, some of them they've never really been seriously supervised or regulated in the past. And that's a challenge even in other countries. And so I think, one's not expected to have a perfect system immediately. I think the issue is going to be, have we at least put the legal mechanisms in place, and do we have a risk-based approaches, and can we at least target the biggest risk even within those areas? And there are going to be tough challenges over time, but I think we can show that we've made significant progress. In a sense, the threat of a grey listing, I think, has concentrated minds and got to make sure that our criminal justice system actually begins to work better when you deal with financial crimes. And even when you look at the terror finance mechanisms, last week we had a workshop with which we co-hosted with the US Treasury, with many banks in the region. And it's a way for, I think, different players to understand what the US authorities expect of their banks on that side. So what does that mean for correspondent banking? Correspondent banking is essential to banking and to trade and economic growth. So ensuring that line is not affected, those lines of credit and transactions are not affected, I think is critical. And I think that to the extent that we demonstrate to the major banks that our banks deal with, I think that will all be a big plus. So I'm optimistic that we'd be able to either prevent grey listing or get out of it pretty quickly.
And Stuart, I'll be with you in a moment, but I just want to stick with Ishmael. A devil's advocate question would be, the process of making amendments to existing legislation or laws. That process, it takes a while. It takes a long time. And also, when it comes to reforming the criminal justice system, that falls outside of the National Treasury's reach. So those are the two challenges here. You don't see them as big challenges at all?
No, they're definitely big challenges. And like you're right, it's not Treasury that gets involved in that. And in fact, we can't, as you know, we can't interfere in cases and so on. So, but I think even with them, we've certainly developed pretty strong relationships, made them aware of, in a sense, of the economic consequences of them acting too slowly. That I think they've realized that their own performance is, in a sense, under observation, and have certainly begun to get their house in order. They still have a long way to go, no doubt about that. And, we can see from the plethora of cases linked even to state capture or corruption, there's much to be done, and they need to move faster. But certainly that awareness has definitely got through to them. Even with the other authorities that we deal with, as I said, on terror financing, I'm beginning to get a sense that they're doing things now that they didn't do before, and that there's a greater focus on this. So yes, I can't vouch for it. I'm also hopeful, but clearly that their progress will have to be sustained and so on, and yeah.
Stuart, I think, by the way, Intellidex recently compiled a report about the implications of South Africa being potentially grey listed. It's quite a useful report. And I think in the report, Stuart, I think you said, or Intellidex that is, said there's like an 85% chance of South Africa being possibly grey listed. That's quite a huge possibility, that is.
Well, that's where we positioned the odds at that time that we wrote the report. I think events move and can change things. For a while it looked like Parliament was not going to make fast enough progress with the legislation, but that changed late last week, where SCOF made some significant progress. Look, it's all hands on deck. I think that, as Momo said, there's a path that is feasible, that's possible to avoid grey listing. But I feel like, we've just lost a third-ranked team in the World Cup, and we're now imagining how it might be possible to still make the finals. there is a possibility, but it takes too many pieces to come into place, and we're just too far from being able to achieve that. So that's our view. But I think it's really important to emphasize that the consequences really will be a factor of how much progress we've made at the point of greylisting. So the FATF plenary will release a report really assessing our progress. And we want that report to say that there has been really good progress, that South Africa has shown really great determination. We wanted to say that our financial sector represents best global practice in dealing with money laundering, even if there are problems like dealing with other accountable institutions. So that report is going to be nuanced, and it's going to affect how people respond to South African greylisting. So we still need to be pushing as hard as we can. And even if we are greylisted, all hands need to be on deck to make sure that that is as short as possible. We've seen other countries like Mauritius, which was greylisted a few years ago. It managed to exit the grey list within 20 months. And it did that by really throwing all political capital and all efforts to address the issues that FATF raised, and it was able to satisfy the plenary that it had done so. And that's really got to be the path that we need to follow if we're greylisted. And it's going to take considerable political will, coordination across all regulators and supervisors, as well as the participation of business, right? Because part of the things that cause problems and delays here is if accountable institutions, and we've talked about attorney firms, car dealers, Krugerrand dealers, and so on, if they don't cooperate, they can delay and slow things as well. And that has negative consequences for all of business. So it's important. This is not just a government problem. We really need to pull together. If we do that, then we might be greylisted, but the consequences will not be significant, and it will be a short-term effect, and we can get on with business. But if we don't show that we have all hands on deck, then the consequences will be more serious.
And Stuart, Pakistan is often used as a greylisting case study. I think there was a study last year on Pakistan which showed that its greylisting cost the economy about $14 billion, or about 240 billion rand, between 2012 and 2015. And the country's economy took some time to recover after being greylisted. I mean, is this the kind of hit to South Africa's economy, the kind of hit South Africa would face if it were to be greylisted? Is this a similar impact, you think, or would happen?
I think Pakistan's experience is a bit different. So Pakistan has been on and off the grey list for over a decade. The main focus in its case is terrorist financing. So obviously, being implicated in certain acts of terror around the world really positions the global reputational issue it faces quite differently to ours. On the other hand, Pakistan does not have as integrated a financial system as South Africa does. Doesn't have kind of banks that are globally active. So it's difficult to apply the Pakistan experience to draw conclusions for how South Africa will be affected. On the one hand, we have many channels of funding mechanisms for our financial system. We have global portfolio flows into our stock exchange, our bond markets, and so on. And the evidence shows that those kind of portfolio flows are not particularly affected, that the main kind of flows that are affected are direct relationships between banks and other financial institutions. And in South Africa's case, because we have these active capital markets, there are alternative sources of funding. So we might see some adaptation of the financial system, moving away from areas that are affected by greylisting to others that might lessen the impact of greylisting. And that is something South Africa can do that other countries could not do, and it might cushion us. On the other hand, there are some areas that will be inflamed by our integration into the rest of the world. We depend much more on that integration, so greylisting can be more harmful. It's very difficult to call the economic impact in advance, other than to say it will be worse if we're perceived not to be acting aggressively.
Yeah, and I just wonder for public finances, the impact on public finances if we were to be grey listed. I mean, the government borrows money in in international markets, and I think some borrowers or funders, such as the IMF, the International Monetary Fund, I think requires that countries that seek funding from it not be on the grey list. Please correct me if I'm wrong. And I'm sure the World Bank will also apply that kind of standard. Ishmael, I mean, will that be quite devastating for South Africa in terms of borrowings? How South Africa borrows in international markets if it were to be grey listed?
Look, I'm not so sure about the IMF and the World Bank having that as a condition.
Sure.
Certainly, I know that there are implications, like with the EU, for example. They will automatically blacklist. So you do have some governments who do it, and certainly if you are dependent on aid from the EU, that would be affected. I think, as you know, the South African economy is much more in the private domain in terms of flows, and I think, as we both said, it just depends on what the underlying or why we ultimately get grey listed, and if we are seen to have really made good progress and only put there because we just need a bit of time, I think the impact will be minimal for now. But, again, we just can't take things for granted. I think also when we compare to other countries, I think Stewart's highlighted that too, that, it's not quite the same as South Africa. We are going to be the first big economy to be grey listed or facing grey listing in terms of the current methodology that FATF is using. Turkey and so on were grey listed in terms of, I think, I may be wrong, but an earlier methodology. What you find with FATF is that it's also over time changed its methodology. They get tougher and tougher. And so before, when we did our mutual evaluation in 2010, for example, there were no effectiveness measures. Or you needed just to have your legal framework. So that got changed somewhere around 2015, 2016 in terms of implementation. And so we are also in a kind of new space, even from a FATF perspective, that we're the first major economy, and in fact, member of FATF that face grey listing. There have been smaller ones like Iceland, but certainly from a big economy, and of course Turkey. But I think South Africa is, I think, the first one in the current kind of circumstances.
Mm-hmm. There's a question. I want to go to questions. Ishmael, I think this one is for you. It's about Bain & Co., the consulting firm that was implicated in serious corruption allegations by the Zondo Commission and the Nugent Commission. The National Treasury, for context, recently banned Bain from tendering government contracts due to its work at SARS. Bain denies any wrongdoing. Let's put that out there. Is the National Treasury considering... What do you have to say about that, Ishmael?
I think anyone who just reads the Nugent Commission's report, they have a huge case to answer. And of course, they did not comply both with the Nugent Commission. They had their own so-called internal investigations, and they made none of those reports available. And frankly, I'm not going to talk to a local Bain representative. If they really, really want to come, they need to explain, they need to provide all those reports, the internal reports. They need to bring their CEO and top management to come here and apologize. And they need to lay charges, criminal charges, against those responsible. Not just, what was his name? Mazzoni.
Yeah.
But the guys back at the head office. So, and we are certainly as Treasury cooperating with US authorities to take this much, much further. So they need to clean up and stop thinking that we're going to fall for their adverts that they put out in newspapers.
And you've been very consistent with that approach for many years now. But is the Treasury considering a similar ban on companies like McKinsey, for example, which did work at Transnet, Eskom, and I think SAA? Because if you're going to talk about consequence management, especially regarding state capture, surely consequence management should go further beyond just ban, hey?
No, it should. Look, one needs to look at current laws. Our current laws kind of limit such action. The action against Bain was done in terms of the not the PFMA, but the triple PFA. And it's in terms of the way the system works is the department that dealt with the tender can kind of complain about non-compliance with with whatever procurement contract. So it's in terms of that. So it really does depend, I think, with each of those companies. The action has to come from the affected entity. And yes, I do think McKinsey has a lot of explaining to do as well. So all these companies do need to come clean beyond just paying back the money. I think we want to see real action against the individuals that they employed at the time. It's always difficult, by the way, when it becomes a corporate structure about how do you, what sort of punitive measures can you put in place? So, some of those complexities I would imagine have to be taken into account. But it is new territory, and certainly when we proceed with this new public procurement bill, we are going to toughen the measures to make it much easier for us to take administrative action like banning when companies clearly abuse South Africa.
I often wonder, some of these companies, Ishmael, do they still do business with the state or state organs? I just wonder, do you have any knowledge of that?
Well, one's got to go company by company. I mean, the Treasury's system allows it to look through national and provincial government departments, not SOEs or not municipalities. But just by asking around, I know that certainly Bain is not doing business, it seems, with any organ of state currently. But, we can only check on that for some categories from a systems perspective.
Okay, I'm going to blitz through the questions. Jeffrey Nalting says, how would one think about quantifying the impact of an SA greylisting when we have relatively deep and more liquid financial markets when compared to other comparable countries that have been greylisted? I think, Stuart, you did talk about this, huh? Anything to add to that?
Yeah, I think on the one hand, deep liquid capital markets are a defensive mechanism that help limit the impact. But there is reputational consequence, right? So anybody applying, for instance, ESG screening is going to look at FATF as an indicator of governance in the country, and that will be factored into investment decisions and will direct capital away from the country. So it's difficult to anticipate, but the fact that we do have a sophisticated and liquid financial system is going to, in some ways, protect us from the full consequences.
Soria Hay says, how could the recent billions of SASFIN offshore transfers reported happen in the context of FIC and suspicious transaction reporting? Anybody?
I mean, that particular issue, I don't have the insight. That's very much a regulatory compliance matter between SASFIN and the Reserve Bank. And I would expect that the fact that it came to light is a result of these kind of monitoring and so on.
And I still want to check more questions. Okay, we've dealt with the Bain question. Neil Cole says, is there any is an analysis of the various types of violations, what proportion of violations relate to non-compliance of existing legislation by legitimate businesses, and the activities of criminal syndicates. Not to my knowledge. Ishmael?
I mean,
no, I don't think so. No, but certainly, I think these are areas that you hope that government really needs to improve its capability. I look at the FIC and I say, but they need, big data analysts who can go through all the data that they get from the banks. Similarly, if you look at procurement, there's quite a bit of data. It may not be as much as we like, but certainly there needs to be more data mining. But also, I think, when I said that our system is a bit naive, I find that, if you're going to deal with corruption, you're not going to be able to deal with it with a spontaneous approach. Just like getting rid of apartheid didn't happen spontaneously. It needs, one needs to actually have a proper strategy and plans in place, a lot of analysis. And what I find is that our system is too innocent. People are not thinking about this every day. So if you look at the procurement system, and I blame us as Treasury, by the way, it may not have been like the most glamorous area of involvement. Many of us got involved in, modernizing the budget process and reforming it. And in fact, the late Andre Roux played a great role. So it was really sad to see him pass away a few days ago. But he was one of the great leaders, I think, in the Treasury. But coming to procurement, I don't think we certainly didn't do that. And we were almost passive. So looking back, we should have, certainly planned the system to deal with such eventualities. And by the way, and that's why those are the questions that I ask, even of state capture, because beyond what the Zondo Commission has looked at, I say, but there were all those audit committees and their chairs at Eskom and Transnet. What were they doing between 2010 and 2017? There were the internal controls. Where are their reports? Did anybody report on it? Where were the auditors? Okay. Now, what we find is that kind of forensic questioning is not there, and then designing a system so that you actually have much stronger preventive controls. And certainly with state capture, I believe that despite the system not being as developed as it should have been, there were many, many red flags that still came out. And the bigger issue then is, did we act on the red flags? Did people act quickly enough on the red flags? And if they didn't act, why didn't they act? And can we hold people accountable? So, to answer that question, I think one of the things I want to do in the Treasury is actually
Oh goodness, we seem to have lost Ishmael. Okay, let me continue. I'm sure he will reconnect. Stuart Francesco.
I think the President's response to the Zondo Commission that he released last month on the 22nd of October, the Commission did talk about setting up an anti-corruption commission. And I think some of the steps that the President's outlined, I think implementing those will take us some way, but we still need to develop new capabilities that we currently don't have. So, yeah, let me stop there. I can go on forever on this area. You're quite strong about it.
Ishmael, a lot of people would ask this question with respect to procurement, and the Zondo Commission has already identified that procurement is where most of the state capture corruption has happened. I commiserate and sympathize with the National Treasury that, procurement is a huge function in government. Is the Treasury able to detect in real time any corruption that takes place in the various procurement functions at all? Does the Treasury have the capacity at the moment, considering that how large the procurement function is?
No, I can't. I certainly can't claim that we have that capacity. And as I said, even in terms of having sight of the system, we can only do that for national and provincial departments. We can't see what's happening at ESCOM or Transnet, and I don't think we ever will, because you can't just have one system for everyone. But to the extent that you have a system to pick up, let's say, abuses in procurement, you expect certainly boards to check on the integrity of their procurement processes. You need the auditors to regard procurement as high risk. You don't have to do an assessment to determine that that's where you're going to have the most abuses. And I don't think that the system currently functions that way. And so, that's why I say, in response to the Zondo Commission, and in fact, even before, even whilst it was doing its work, those are the kinds of questions that I'm asking myself to say, how can we actually put in the kinds of controls and internal mechanisms to pick up these problems? But as I said, and when you pick it up, you've got lots of red flags to make sure that at different levels, people act appropriately and speedily to deal with those kinds of problems. I don't think that any one place like Treasury can oversee the entire procurement. It's not possible. You've got to make sure that at every level, and most systems are decentralized, that people are doing the right thing where they sit. So it's building the ethics, getting the culture right, I think, are going to be just as important if we're going to deal with the types of problems that we experience.
Yeah. There was a question from Francesca. I really lost it. Oh, there we go. Maybe this one for you, Stuart. What role do you think the new and upcoming regulations on cyber assets will play in avoiding a grey listing in South Africa? I mean, one of the bills that have been tabled in Parliament, one of the bill includes, I think, cyber crime in the definition of terrorist activity. So is that harmful at all?
I presume the question is thinking of cyber crypto assets.
Crypto assets, that's right. I think they've been declared as a financial product in South Africa.
They've been declared as a financial product, yeah. So that's very progressive in dealing with conduct risks. I think from a money laundering perspective, FATF's not that switched on to the use of crypto in money laundering. That's my view. It doesn't really feature in their reports. Momo might have a closer insight. So at the moment, crypto has not been focused on by FATF, but it is clearly a money laundering risk. It can be used as a mechanism, certainly, to move money and clean it up.
Yeah. Sure, Ishmael. That's quite concerning, hey?
Sorry, just say that. Sorry.
That's quite concerning that cryptocurrencies are not really in the purview of FATF.
You've got to understand how FATF works. I mean, FATF, just has its recommendations, like Stuart outlined. It doesn't focus on particular areas, so it will look at areas of what it would see as money laundering. Look, this is an area. We go to many meetings internationally. Certainly, if you look at the Financial Stability Board, I mean, the whole crypto area, I mean, is just front and center of a lot of the work, and clearly the kind of potential abuses. Has been recognized, but recognizing doesn't mean that we can deal with it much better. And we too have been slow in just declaring it a financial product. And you've seen even internationally with this, the last few days with FTX and what's happened. So somehow I do worry that it's almost like we are naked facing the forces when it comes to the whole crypto area.
We have about 4 minutes left, and I want to focus on the discussion about if we are grey listed, what will it take for us to exit the grey list? I mean, many countries have been grey listed and moved out as well. Stuart, for you, your closing remarks about what should the focus be going forward?
Look, we've got to get to the effectiveness. We've got to focus on making our regulators effective. We've got to have the FIC become an effective regulator. We've got to make sure the hawks are much more capable of investigating money laundering, beneficial ownership to work across trusts, companies, and NGOs, by the way. It's another big area that we have a lot of work to do. We've got to get SARS and to be much better at tracking cash moving across borders, because at the moment there's no restriction to walking across the border with any amount of foreign currency you want. So all of these things have to become practical and real, and we've got to do it as fast as possible. Now, FATF, we can request FATF to come and review our progress at any point, and we need to set clear deadlines for ourselves when we're going to want those reviews to happen, to really focus the mind and push everyone in the right direction. I think we also really need political leadership from the top. I mentioned Mauritius earlier and their exemplary case of getting off the grey list, and it's because the Prime Minister really championed it right from the top. And I think one of the challenges here is that FATF compliance requires coordination across many areas of government, many regulators, and that, I think, needs the stamp and authority of the presidency to add political will to the urgency of the effort. So I'd want to see that happening too. But this is an opportunity, as Momo indicated earlier, to get a whole lot of things right that have never been right in the past. And we can end up, as a result of this process, in a far stronger anti-corruption position than we ever have been, and it might well have the consequence of improving the way we do business, the levels of trust in society, reducing transaction costs, and ultimately improving the performance of the economy. So if we use this opportunity and really deliver, it might leave us with a positive legacy overall.
And Ishmael, you're very positive that we might avoid a grey listing. What's your focus over the next 6 to 12 months, maybe?
Yeah, look, I mean, I think, I agree with what Stewart's also said. I think that there's an opportunity here, and just given, both the State Capture Commission and the FATF grey listing, that in a sense, if there's an opportunity and we are fixing up our system, and for its own sake, not because anybody's telling us, we need to do it for our own interests, improve our capability to deal with financial crimes. And I think that those, we're also going to need to prove that it's not just a once-off, that because there'll be another mutual evaluation in a few years. So we're going to have to show that we've actually, these are permanent changes that have been made, and that we are consistently improving our system, which will then, I think, have huge benefits on growth, on bringing down crime, on making South Africa just a better place to live in.
We all want a better place to live in. I think everyone can agree with that. But Ishmael Momoniat of the National Treasury and Dr. Stuart Theobald of Intellidex, thank you so much. This is a really good conversation, very enlightening. And to everybody who participated in this webinar, thank you so much. There is a recording of the webinar. It'll be available later in the day. So if you want to rewatch the webinar, please do so. And thank you so much to ENSafrica once again for supporting the webinar. Thank you so much, all. Gentlemen, thanks.
Thank you. Thank you, Ray. Thank you, Stuart.
Thanks.
Take care. Bye-bye.
Cheers.
Okay, bye.